It's okay. Take your time.
I don't know what else to do.
I can give you $40. The words hit Imani Washington like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs as she stared down at David's wedding ring lying in the pawnshop owner's calloused palm. $40. For the only piece of her husband she had left. For the symbol of their 7 years together. For the ring he'd slipped onto her finger in their tiny apartment while her mother held baby Trayvon, promising her forever in a world that seemed determined to give them nothing. Her stomach clenched with a familiar emptiness that had nothing to do with her own hunger and everything to do with the way Trayvon had looked at her that morning. Those wide brown eyes, David's eyes, staring up from his makeshift bed on their living room floor, asking without words why there was no breakfast again. Why Mommy kept opening and closing empty cabinets. Why the lights had been turned off yesterday. $40, Imani repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Through the scratched glass display case, she could see expensive watches gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Rolex. Cartier. Probably worth more than she'd made in the past year of cleaning office buildings at night while Trayvon slept in the car. The pawnshop owner, a thin white man with graying hair who'd introduced himself as Harold, shifted uncomfortably. Look, lady, gold prices are down, and this. He held up the simple band, examining it under a magnifying glass with the practiced disinterest of someone who'd seen 1,000 desperate stories walk through his door. This isn't exactly high-end. High-end. Imani almost laughed, but the sound would have come out broken. David had saved for 8 months to buy that ring, working double shifts at the warehouse, skipping lunches, walking the 12 blocks to work instead of taking the bus. She remembered the night he proposed, how his hands shook as he told her he knew it wasn't much, but someday, when things got better, he'd get her something worthy of her. Things were supposed to get better. 4 to 5, Harold said, perhaps mistaking her silence for negotiation. Final offer. Imani's fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, checking the time. 2:47 p.m. Trayvon would be getting out of school in an hour, walking home to an apartment with no food, no electricity, and now, if she went through with this, no last connection to his father. She'd already sold everything else. Her grandmother's china, her nursing textbooks from before Trayvon was born, even David's tools that she'd hoped to save for their son someday. Behind her, the door chimed as another customer entered. She didn't turn around, couldn't bear to see another person witnessing this moment, but she heard Harold's voice brighten considerably. Mrs. Patterson, how can I help you today? Oh, just browsing, Harold. My daughter's birthday is coming up, and I thought I might find something special. The warmth in Harold's voice when he spoke to Mrs. Patterson, whoever she was, cut through Imani like a blade. She'd heard that tone before, in grocery stores where cashiers smiled at white customers while watching her with suspicious eyes. In school offices where teachers spoke to white parents with respect while treating her like an inconvenience. In hospitals where David had died, where nurses offered comfort to other grieving widows while leaving her to navigate paperwork and funeral arrangements alone. Take your time, she heard herself say, stepping back from the counter. I need a moment to think. But Harold was already sliding the ring back across the counter toward her, his attention shifting to the browsing customer. Actually, I've got other people to help. You decide and come back. Imani stared at the ring sitting on the scratched glass, David's ring, and felt something fracture inside her chest. Not break. She'd been breaking for 8 months now, since the heart attack that took him at 32. Since the medical bills that consumed their savings, since the landlord's threats and the utility shutoffs and the slow realization that widowed black mothers don't get grace periods in America. This was something deeper. A recognition that she'd reached the bottom of a well she'd been falling down since the day she buried her husband. Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. Some stories are too close to my heart to share on YouTube. I send those, along with little life lessons and surprises, to my email circle. If you'd like to be part of it, you can join with the link in the description. $4 to $5, she said quietly, picking up the ring one last time. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with memories and promises and dreams that would never come true. She thought about David slipping it onto her finger, how he'd whispered that it would keep part of him with her always. Maybe he'd understand. Maybe, somehow, keeping their son fed was what love looked like now. Harold glanced up from where he was showing Mrs. Patterson a delicate gold bracelet. What's that? I said yes. $4 to $5. Something flickered across Harold's face, surprise, maybe, or discomfort. For just a moment, Imani wondered if he'd expected her to walk away, if he'd made the offer low enough to send her home with her dignity and her ring intact. But then he was nodding, reaching for a form, and the moment passed. "I'll need your ID and signature." Imani fumbled for her wallet, extracting her driver's license with fingers that wouldn't quite stop shaking. As Harold copied down her information, she noticed him glance at her address, the subsidized housing complex on the south side that everyone in town knew about but nobody talked about. "You can reclaim it within 90 days, he said, not quite meeting her eyes as he counted out the bills. "Interest rate is 20% monthly." 20% monthly. Imani did the math automatically, a skill poverty had taught her well. To get David's ring back, she'd need $54 in 30 days, or $64 in 60 days. Numbers that might as well have been $1 million. She took the money, crisp bills that felt obscene in her hands, and turned toward the door. Mrs. Patterson was examining a pair of earrings now, chatting pleasantly with Harold about her daughter's upcoming graduation from law school. Imani caught fragments of their conversation: vacation in Europe, internship at a prestigious firm, proud parents. The door chimed behind her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, Imani stood frozen in the afternoon sunlight, $45 clutched in her fist and David's ring already disappearing into Harold's inventory. She didn't know that Harold's security camera had captured every moment of their transaction, or that Mrs. Patterson, who'd recognized her from the grocery store where they both shopped, though they'd never spoken, had been watching the entire exchange with growing discomfort. She didn't know that within hours, both the footage and Mrs. Patterson's disturbed retelling of what she'd witnessed would find their way onto social media, or that by tomorrow morning, her most private moment of desperation would be viewed by millions of strangers. All Imani knew was that she had enough money to buy groceries for the week, and maybe, if she was careful, enough left over to get the electricity turned back on. She started walking toward the grocery store, David's ring already becoming a memory, unaware that she'd just set in motion a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the way an entire nation looked at poverty, motherhood, and the quiet sacrifices that happen in pawnshops every single day. The revolution had begun with $45 and a mother's love. But first, she needed to buy her son dinner. Imani's hands moved automatically through the grocery store aisles, calculating prices with the precision of someone for whom every penny carried weight. $45. Rice, beans, eggs, milk for Trayvon, maybe some ground beef if the discount meat was still available. She'd learned to shop the margins, expired coupons that sympathetic cashiers sometimes honored, dented cans marked down 50%, day-old bread that would last them through the weekend. At the rice aisle, she encountered Mrs. Chester from the apartment next door, an elderly woman who spoke limited English but had somehow become Imani's unofficial guardian angel over the past few months. Mrs. Chester's grandson attended the same school as Trayvon, and she'd taken to leaving containers of leftover soup outside Imani's door with notes written in careful, shaky handwriting. "For the boy." "Imani," Mrs. Chester said softly, touching her arm. "You look tired." The kindness in her voice nearly undid what little composure Imani had left. She'd grown so accustomed to navigating the world with her guard up, in the welfare office where caseworkers spoke to her like she was trying to scam the system, at Trayvon's school where some teachers looked at her worn clothes and assumed she didn't care about her son's education, at the temp agencies where she competed with dozens of other desperate women for minimum wage work with no benefits. "I'm okay," Imani replied automatically, the response she'd perfected over 8 months of not being okay. "How's Tommy?" Mrs. Chester's face brightened at the mention of her grandson. "Good boy. Always asking about Trayvon. They studied together yesterday, you remember? Tommy very worried because Trayvon says light's not working." Shame burned hot in Imani's chest. She'd told Trayvon to keep their problems private, but what 8-year-old could resist confiding in his closest friend? "We're getting it fixed," she lied smoothly. "Just a temporary thing." Mrs. Chester studied her face with the sharp perception of someone who'd survived her own share of hardships. "I have extra food tonight. Grandson eats like bird. You come over, bring Trayvon." No arguments. Before Imani could protest, Mrs. Chester was already walking away, her decision made. It was the kind of matter-of-fact generosity that had kept Imani afloat these past months. Small kindnesses from people who understood struggle, even when they couldn't offer much themselves. Imani continued through the store, her mind drifting back to the life she'd been building before everything collapsed. She'd been 3 semesters away from finishing her nursing degree when she got pregnant with Trayvon. David had insisted she could go back to school after the baby came, but between childcare costs and his warehouse salary, it never seemed possible. Then David died, and the dream of wearing scrubs and helping people heal felt as distant as the moon. The nursing program had been her father's idea, actually. Before he'd walked out when she was 16, before her mother started working 3 jobs just to keep their apartment, he used to tell her she had healing hands. "You're going to save lives someday, baby girl," he'd say, watching her bandage her dolls with the gentle precision that would later make her excellent at tending David's work injuries or soothing Trayvon's scraped knees. She'd believed him then. Believed that hard work and determination could overcome anything, that America rewarded people who played by the rules and kept their heads down. David had believed it too. Right up until the heart attack that took him during a mandatory overtime shift, when the company's health insurance proved to have more loopholes than coverage. At the checkout line, Imani found herself behind a woman roughly her age, well dressed in the casual way that suggested money wasn't a daily consideration. The woman was buying organic produce, name brand everything, chatting pleasantly with the cashier about her book club and weekend plans. Imani watched her pull out a credit card without checking the total, without calculating whether she had enough, without the careful anxiety that governed every transaction in Imani's life. "That'll be $42.50, the cashier said when Imani's turn came. Imani handed over the money, leaving her with $2.50 until she could find more work. The cashier, a young black woman named Destiny who'd been kind to Imani in the past, leaned closer as she bagged the groceries. "Girl, you know they are hiring at the hospital cafeteria," Destiny whispered. "Night shift, but it's steady pay and benefits after 90 days. My cousin works there." Hope flickered in Imani's chest. Hospital work, even in the cafeteria, felt like a step toward the medical field she'd dreamed of. "Thank you," she said, meaning it. "I'll check it out." Walking home with her groceries, Imani felt something approaching optimism for the first time in weeks. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe pawning David's ring, as painful as it was, had been the sacrifice needed to get them through until something better came along. She didn't know that 3 miles away, Harold was having a crisis of conscience. The pawnshop owner had been running his business for 15 years, and he'd seen plenty of desperate people trade precious items for cash. But something about Imani's transaction had stuck with him, maybe the way she'd held that ring like it contained pieces of her soul, or how young she looked, or how Mrs. Patterson had stared at him accusingly after Imani left. "That was somebody's wedding ring," Mrs. Patterson had said, her voice tight with disapproval. "That poor woman was probably starving." Harold had tried to explain that he was running a business, not a charity, but Mrs. Patterson's words haunted him. That evening, he found himself reviewing the security footage, watching Imani's face as she made the decision to sell. The camera had captured everything: her trembling hands, the way she'd closed her eyes when she said yes, the careful way she'd counted the money afterward. Without fully understanding why, Harold uploaded the footage to his Facebook page with a caption that would change everything. "This happened in my shop today. A young mother sold her wedding ring to buy food for her child. In America. In 2025. What kind of society are we living in?" He meant it as a general commentary on poverty, maybe hoping a few friends would share it and generate some sympathy for Imani. He certainly didn't expect the post to explode across social media within hours, shared by thousands of strangers who saw in Imani's story a reflection of their own struggles or their deepest fears about how quickly life could fall apart. By the time Imani was putting Trayvon to bed that night, in Mrs. Chester's apartment, where they'd shared a dinner of homemade dumplings and steamed vegetables, her face was being viewed by hundreds of thousands of people across the country. Comment sections filled with outrage, sympathy, and offers to help. Local news stations picked up the story. A GoFundMe page appeared, created by a stranger in Seattle who'd been moved to tears by the footage. Imani had no idea that her most private moment had become public property, that her story was spreading like wildfire through a digital world she barely participated in. Her phone was an old model that barely handled texts and calls, and social media felt like a luxury for people with time and emotional energy she couldn't spare. She tucked Trayvon into Mrs. Chester's guest bed, kissing his forehead and promising him that tomorrow would be better. He'd eaten well tonight, laughed with Tommy, completed his homework under Mrs. Chester's patient supervision. For a few hours, he'd been just a regular 8-year-old, not a child carrying the weight of his family's survival. "Mama," Trayvon whispered as she turned off the light. "Are we going to be okay?" The question hung in the darkness, heavy with the perceptiveness of children who grow up too fast. Imani sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing his hair, David's hair, with the same stubborn cowlick that never laid flat. "We're going to be more than okay, baby," she whispered back, the lie coming easier now. Mama's got a plan. But as she settled onto Mrs. Chester's couch for the night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the gentle sounds of Trayvon's breathing from the next room, Imani felt the familiar anxiety creeping back. $4 to $5 wouldn't last forever. The electricity bill would still be waiting when they went home tomorrow. And somewhere in the city, David's ring sat in a pawnshop display case, just another piece of someone else's broken dreams waiting for a buyer. She had no way of knowing that by morning, everything would change. That her private desperation had already become a public rallying cry, or that people across the country were opening their wallets and their hearts to a woman they'd never met but whose story had touched something deep and universal in their souls. The revolution had begun while she slept, sparked by a pawnshop owner's guilty conscience and fueled by a nation's recognition of its own failures. But first, there would be the shock of discovery, and with it, the complicated blessing and curse of unwanted fame. Her phone buzzed with yet another call. This time, the caller ID showed a name that made her heart race: Attorney Ethan Sterling. Not just any attorney. She recognized the name from billboards around the city, from late-night television commercials promising to fight for people who'd been wronged by the system. Against her better judgment, she answered. Mrs. Washington, my name is Ethan Sterling. I've been following your story, and I believe you may have grounds for a lawsuit against several parties. The pawnshop for predatory lending practices, possibly the city for inadequate social services, maybe even your late husband's employer for insufficient life insurance coverage. A lawsuit. Imani had never considered that her desperation might have legal remedies, that her suffering might be someone else's liability. I don't understand. What happened to you represents a systemic failure, Mrs. Washington. You shouldn't have been put in a position where selling your wedding ring was your only option. My firm specializes in cases like this, situations where institutions have failed the people they are supposed to protect. Ethan Sterling's voice carried the polished confidence of someone accustomed to turning other people's pain into legal victories. He spoke about her story as if it were a case study, her emotions as if they were evidence, her private choices as if they were public wrongdoings that demanded compensation. I don't want to sue anyone, Imani said quietly. I just want to take care of my son. Mrs. Washington, with respect, this is bigger than what you want now. Your story has touched millions of people. You have a platform, a voice that people are listening to. We could turn this into real change, real accountability. And yes, real compensation for what you've endured. Real compensation. Imani thought about the electricity bill, about Trayvon's growing feet that needed new shoes, about the nursing degree that felt impossible to pursue while working multiple minimum wage jobs. Money from a lawsuit wouldn't come with the complex emotions of charity. It would be earned, deserved, a recognition that what had happened to her was wrong rather than just unfortunate. Think about it, Ethan Sterling continued. But don't wait too long. Public attention spans are short, and we need to act while your story still has momentum. By Thursday morning, Imani's life had become unrecognizable. The GoFundMe had surpassed $90,000, her story had been picked up by national news outlets, and the apartment complex had installed temporary barriers to control the crowds of reporters, curious onlookers, and people claiming to be supporters who wanted to meet her in person. She sat in the community center's small conference room, having agreed to her first official interview with CNN after Ethan Sterling convinced her that controlling the narrative was better than letting others tell her story. The reporter, Elena Vasquez, had kind eyes and spoke with the gentle authority of someone who'd covered human interest stories for years. I want people to understand, Elena was saying, adjusting her notes, that this isn't just about poverty. It's about the impossible choices facing millions of American families. Your story has resonated because it could happen to anyone. Could happen to anyone. Imani wasn't sure she believed that anymore. After 3 days of living in the public eye, she'd learned that sympathy came with conditions. People wanted her to be the right kind of poor, grateful but not demanding, struggling but not hopeless, relatable but not too real. Before we start recording, Elena continued, I should mention that we've been contacted by several people claiming to know you. High school classmates, former co-workers. Is there anyone specific you'd like us to interview for context? Imani's stomach tightened. She'd been dreading this moment, when her current story would collide with her past, when reporters would start digging into the choices that had led her to that pawnshop counter. I'd prefer to speak for myself. Elena nodded professionally, but Imani caught the flicker of disappointment. The reporter had clearly hoped for childhood friends who could testify to Imani's character, former teachers who remembered her potential, a narrative arc that would satisfy viewers who needed poverty to have clear causes and solutions. What Elena didn't know, what Imani had no intention of sharing, was that her high school years had been marked by her father's abandonment and her mother's descent into depression and alcohol. That many of her classmates remembered her as the girl who worked weekends instead of attending parties, who wore the same 5 outfits in rotation, who disappeared after graduation without the fanfare of college acceptance letters or career plans. Before the interview could begin, Imani's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw you on the news. Still making bad choices. I see. Some things never change." Ah! The message hit her like a physical blow. Raymond. Trayvon's father, not David, who'd raised Trayvon as his own, but the man who'd walked away when she was 7 months pregnant, claiming the baby probably wasn't his anyway. Imani's hands trembled as she deleted the text, hoping Elena hadn't noticed her sudden pallor. Raymond had been silent for 9 years, absent through Trayvon's birth, David's love and adoption of the boy, David's death, and every struggle since. Now, with cameras and donations and national attention, he'd crawled out of whatever hole he'd been hiding in. The interview proceeded smoothly on the surface. Elena asked thoughtful questions about single motherhood, about the inadequacy of social services, about Imani's hopes for the future. But underneath, Imani felt the growing weight of everything she wasn't saying, about Raymond, about the shame she'd carried since becoming pregnant at 19, about the way David had been her salvation in every sense of the word. What would you say to critics who suggest that private charity shouldn't be necessary, that government programs should be sufficient? Elena asked. It was a fair question, but it revealed the impossible position Imani found herself in. Answer too passionately about government responsibility, and she'd be labeled ungrateful for the private donations pouring in. Praise the GoFundMe too enthusiastically, and she'd seem to excuse systemic failures that kept families like hers in crisis. "I'm grateful for every act of kindness," Imani said carefully. "But no mother should have to choose between her memories and her child's next meal." After the interview, Imani walked home through the gauntlet of remaining reporters and found an unexpected visitor waiting in Mrs. Chester's apartment. James Harrington sat at the kitchen table, looking exactly as she remembered him from their brief overlap at the community college 9 years ago, tall, serious, with the kind of intense brown eyes that had made her forget, temporarily, that she was a single mother with no business dreaming about graduate students in social work. "Hello, Imani," James said, standing when she entered. His voice carried the same gentle strength that had attracted her all those years ago, before David entered her life and made everything else fade into irrelevance. "James." She couldn't hide her surprise, or the flutter of recognition that felt inappropriate given everything else happening in her life. "What are you doing here?" "I work for the state now. Family Services Division. When your story broke, my supervisor asked me to reach out, see if we could connect you with resources." He paused, his professional demeanor softening slightly. "I volunteered for the assignment." Mrs. Chester appeared from the bedroom where she'd been entertaining Trayvon, took one look at the tension in the room, and announced that she and Trayvon would be visiting Tommy's family downstairs. The sudden privacy felt charged with unspoken history. "You look good," James said quietly. "I mean, considering everything you're going through." "Do I?" Imani laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I feel like I'm drowning in front of the entire country." James moved closer, and she caught a whiff of his cologne, different from what he'd worn in college, more expensive, reflecting the professional success she'd watched from a distance through mutual acquaintances over the years. He'd finished his master's degree, landed a good job with benefits, married a woman named Catherine who worked for a nonprofit. The life Imani might have had if she'd made different choices, if Raymond hadn't happened, if poverty hadn't derailed her education. "I've been following your story," James admitted. "Not just professionally. I've thought about you over the years, wondered how you were doing." The admission hung between them, dangerous and electric. Imani had thought about him too, especially during the hardest months after David's death when she'd wondered what might have been if she'd pursued the connection they'd started before responsibility and circumstance pulled her in other directions. "I'm married," she said quickly, then caught herself. "I was married. David died 8 months ago." "I know. I'm sorry." James's eyes held genuine sympathy. "Catherine and we separated last year. Divorced finalized 2 months ago." The information felt like a gift and a trap simultaneously. Here was James, successful and available, offering professional help while looking at her with the same intensity that had made her 20-year-old heart race. But accepting his interest now, with cameras. still camped outside and her son's stability hanging in the balance, felt like confirmation of every criticism being whispered about her motives and character. The department can fast-track your application for emergency assistance, James continued, shifting back to professional territory. Temporary housing vouchers, childcare subsidies, expedited food stamp approval. You shouldn't have to rely entirely on public donations. Public donations. As if summoned by his words, Imani's phone buzzed with an alert from the GoFundMe page. $112,000. More money than she'd made in the past 3 years combined, donated by strangers who'd been moved by her story but who also expected something from her. Gratitude, inspiration, proof that their money was being used responsibly. There's something else, James said, his voice dropping lower. My supervisor mentioned that there might be an investigation into how you ended up in this situation. Questions about whether social services failed you, whether you were properly informed about available programs. An investigation. Imani felt the walls closing in from yet another direction. She'd applied for assistance programs before, been told about waiting lists and income requirements and documentation that seemed designed to exclude rather than include. But having her desperation scrutinized by government agencies felt like another violation, another layer of public judgment. I followed the rules, she said defensively. I applied for everything I qualified for. I believe you, James said quickly. But there are going to be people looking for someone to blame, and agencies protecting themselves. Your story has embarrassed a lot of officials who don't want to admit that the system failed you. Before Imani could respond, her phone rang. Ethan Sterling's name flashed on the screen, and she realized she'd missed 2 previous calls from him. Mrs. Washington, we need to talk immediately, Ethan said without preamble when she answered. Someone's contacted the media with information about your son's biological father. We need to get ahead of this story before it becomes a problem. Imani's blood turned to ice. Across the room, James watched her face change, his professional instincts clearly picking up on the shift in atmosphere. What kind of information? She managed to ask. Details about your pregnancy, about Mr. Raymond Fletcher's denial of paternity, about your relationship status when you met your late husband. Nothing criminal, but the narrative implications could be damaging. Raymond Fletcher. Imani hadn't heard his full name spoken aloud in years, and hearing it now in Ethan's clinical tone made her feel physically sick. Somehow, Raymond had not only found her but had apparently decided to profit from her sudden notoriety by selling their private history to the highest bidder. Can they legally print that? She asked, aware that James was listening to every word. First Amendment protections are strong, especially for public figures, which you've arguably become. We can threaten legal action, but the most effective strategy is to control the narrative ourselves. Get your version of events on record before anyone else's. Her version of events. As if there were multiple valid interpretations of a 19-year-old woman being abandoned by her baby's father, then rescued by a man who'd loved them both unconditionally. After hanging up, Imani found James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, concern mixed with something that might have been disappointment. Old complications, he asked gently. The worst kind, Imani admitted. She felt trapped in a web of her own making, each thread of her past connecting to others in ways she'd never anticipated. The story that had begun as a simple act of maternal desperation was growing more complex by the hour, pulling in people and events she'd thought were safely buried. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the media encampment adjusting for the evening news broadcasts. Tomorrow, there would be new revelations, new angles, new ways for strangers to dissect and judge the choices she'd made in desperation and love. But tonight, sitting in Mrs. Chester's kitchen with James looking at her like she was still the promising young woman he'd known years ago, Imani felt the dangerous temptation of imagining a different future. One where the money pouring in from strangers could buy not just survival, but transformation. Where the attention focused on her story could become a platform for the life she'd always wanted but never believed she deserved. The question was whether reaching for that future meant betraying the memory of the man who'd already saved her once, or whether David would want her to be brave enough to save herself. Either way, she was about to discover that second chances came with their own devastating costs. The morning news hit Imani like a sledgehammer to the chest. She stood in Mrs. Chester's kitchen, coffee mug frozen halfway to her lips, watching her private history dissected on national television. New revelations have emerged about Imani Washington, the widow whose viral pawnshop video captured America's heart, the anchor announced with practiced gravity. Channel 7's investigative team has uncovered details about Ms. Washington's past that raise questions about the narrative that's driven over $150,000 in donations. The screen filled with a photo Imani had never seen before, herself at 19, visibly pregnant, standing outside a community health clinic. Someone had sold this image to the media, and she knew with sickening certainty who that someone was. According to documents obtained by this station, Ms. Washington's son Trayvon was born to a different father, Raymond Fletcher, who disputed paternity and has remained absent from the child's life. Ms. Washington married her late husband David Washington 6 months after Trayvon's birth, and Mr. Washington legally adopted the boy. Imani's legs gave out. She sank into Mrs. Chester's kitchen chair as the report continued, each word feeling like a physical blow. The question facing donors now is whether Ms. Washington's portrayal of herself as a grieving widow struggling to support her late husband's child represents the full truth. Mr. Fletcher, who contacted our newsroom, claims Ms. Washington has a pattern of using men for financial security and suggests that public sympathy may be misplaced. The screen cut to a phone interview with Raymond, older now, his voice carrying the same casual cruelty she remembered from when he'd walked away from their unborn child. Imani's phone rang again. Another reporter, probably wanting her reaction to the morning's revelations. She declined the call, but immediately received a text from an unknown number. Saw the news. You're even worse than I thought. That poor kid deserves better than a lying whore who tricks good men into playing daddy. Hope they take him away from you. The message was one of dozens flooding her phone. Anonymous cruelty from strangers who felt entitled to judge her worth as a mother based on television reports and social media posts. People who'd never struggled, never been abandoned, never faced the choice between pride and survival. I need to see Trayvon's room, James said, his voice carefully neutral. I need to document his sleeping arrangements, access to food, educational resources. Educational resources. In the bedroom where Trayvon was playing, surrounded by books Mrs. Chester had bought him, wearing clean clothes donated by neighbors, eating regular meals for the first time in months thanks to the kindness of strangers who were now being told their generosity had been misplaced. As James conducted his assessment, asking questions and taking notes with clinical detachment, Imani felt everything she'd built over 9 years of motherhood crumbling around her. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee she'd bandaged, every homework session, every sacrifice, none of it mattered compared to the public perception that she was somehow an unfit guardian. When James finished his documentation, he lingered by the door, his professional facade finally cracking. For what it's worth, he said quietly, you're a good mother. Trayvon is clearly loved, healthy, and well-adjusted. But the media attention has created complications that go beyond my assessment. Complications you helped create by not warning me that my file was being reviewed. James flinched. I thought I could handle it quietly, keep it from becoming public. I was trying to protect you. By lying to me? By sitting in this kitchen yesterday and letting me think you were here as a friend when you were really gathering evidence for an investigation. It wasn't like that. Get out, Imani said quietly. Just get out. After James left, Imani sat alone in Mrs. Chester's kitchen, surrounded by the ruins of her carefully constructed new life. The donations that were supposed to provide security had made her a target. The publicity that was supposed to inspire change had invited scrutiny and judgment. The help that was supposed to lift her up had given others the ammunition to tear her down. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from Ethan Sterling. Emergency meeting at 2 p.m. Channel 7 is running a follow-up story tonight about GoFundMe fraud investigations. We need to discuss strategy immediately. Fraud investigations. They weren't just questioning her fitness as a mother, they were suggesting she'd intentionally deceived donors, that her desperation had been performance art designed to extract sympathy and money from good-hearted strangers. Imani thought about David's ring, sitting in Harold's display case, and realized with devastating clarity that she'd traded more than jewelry for $4 to $5. She'd traded her privacy, her dignity, her right to make mistakes without public judgment. She'd accidentally turned her love for her son into entertainment for millions of strangers who now felt entitled to decide whether that love was worthy of their continued support. The revolution that had begun with maternal sacrifice was devouring the very woman it was supposed to celebrate, and Imani was learning the cruelest lesson of her life. Sometimes the price of survival was everything that made survival worthwhile. Outside, she could hear protesters chanting, some supporting her, others demanding justice for the real victims of poverty who hadn't received viral attention. Her story had become bigger than her life, more important than her truth, and she was powerless to control the narrative that would determine whether she kept her son or lost him to a system that punished desperation while rewarding the appearance of stability. The worst part was the growing realization that everyone who claimed to be helping her, Ethan with his lawsuits, James with his investigation, even the strangers sending money, had their own reasons for being part of her story. She'd become a symbol, a cause, a case study, everything except what she'd always been. Just a mother trying to love her child in a world determined to make that love conditional on public approval. But the fight wasn't over yet. If they wanted to make her story about worthiness, she'd have to find the strength to prove that survival didn't make her weak, it made her dangerous. The emergency meeting at Ethan Sterling's law office felt like a trial where Imani was simultaneously the defendant, the evidence, and the crime scene. Seated around a polished conference table were people who claimed to represent her interests but spoke about her as if she weren't in the room. The situation has deteriorated significantly, Ethan announced, spreading documents across the table like autopsy photos. Channel 7's follow-up investigation revealed that 3 other families in similar circumstances received assistance through proper channels without resorting to dramatic measures. Dramatic measures. As if pawning David's ring had been performance art rather than desperation. What Mr. Sterling is saying, added Rebecca Chester, the crisis management consultant Ethan had hired, is that the narrative has shifted from system failure to personal responsibility. We need to pivot quickly. Rebecca bore no relation to Mrs. Chester, but the shared surname felt like mockery. One Chester family had shown Imani unconditional kindness, while this Chester was being paid to reshape her pain into something more palatable for public consumption. The GoFundMe platform has frozen the account pending investigation, Rebecca continued. Donors are claiming fraud, saying they were misled about your circumstances. The total is now at $247,000, but none of it is accessible until the review is complete. $250,000, sitting in digital limbo while Imani couldn't afford to turn the electricity back on in her own apartment. Money donated by strangers who'd been moved by her story but now felt betrayed by the revelation that real people were more complicated than television narratives. There's more, Ethan said grimly. Raymond Fletcher has filed for emergency custody of Trayvon. He's claiming that your recent behavior, the media appearances, the fundraising, what he's calling exploitation of the child for financial gain, demonstrates unfitness. Imani's hands clenched into fists. He abandoned us. He has no right. Legally, he has every right, Ethan interrupted. Biological fathers retain certain protections, especially when they can demonstrate that circumstances have changed significantly. And Imani, the circumstances have changed significantly. Changed. 3 weeks ago, she'd been invisible, struggling alone with dignity intact. Now she was a public figure whose every choice was analyzed by strangers who felt entitled to judge her worthiness as a mother. Rebecca leaned forward with the practiced sympathy of someone who managed disasters for a living. We can fight this, but it requires a specific strategy. Full transparency, complete cooperation with the investigation, and a public acknowledgement that mistakes were made. What kind of mistakes? Imani asked carefully. Not being fully forthcoming about Trayvon's paternity in initial interviews. Accepting donations under what some perceive as false pretenses. Creating a public spectacle that's arguably harmful to a minor child. Mistakes. Not the mistake of a system that let families fall through cracks, or the mistake of a society that required viral videos to generate compassion. Her mistakes. Her failures to be the perfect victim that strangers needed her to be. What are you asking me to do? Ethan and Rebecca exchanged glances. A public apology, Rebecca said. Taking responsibility for any confusion about your circumstances. Agreeing to donate a significant portion of the GoFundMe proceeds to established charities that help struggling families through proper channels. And in exchange, Raymond withdraws his custody challenge. The state closes its investigation with a finding of no fault. You keep enough money to stabilize your situation, maybe $50,000 after legal fees and donations. $50,000. Still more money than Imani had ever imagined having, but the price was her dignity, her truth, and the acknowledgement that her love for Trayvon had somehow been wrong. I need to think about it, Imani said. You have 24 hours, Ethan replied. The custody hearing is scheduled for Monday. If we're going to settle, we need to move quickly. Outside the law office, Imani found herself wandering the downtown streets where she'd once worked night cleaning jobs. The city looked different from this perspective. Not the hostile environment she navigated as an invisible poor woman, but a place where her face was recognized, where strangers felt entitled to approach her with opinions about her choices. "Excuse me, are you Imani Washington?" A middle-aged white woman blocked her path, phone already recording. "I donated to your GoFundMe, and I just want to say I feel completely betrayed. My grandmother was a single mother who never asked for handouts." Imani tried to step around her, but the woman followed, her voice rising. "You lied to us. You made us think you were some kind of saint when you're just another welfare queen looking for easy money." Welfare queen. The phrase hit like a slap, carrying decades of coded racism and class hatred. Imani had worked since she was 16, had never collected welfare except for brief food stamp assistance after David died, had built a life through exhausting determination. But none of that mattered to strangers who needed to believe that poverty was a moral failing rather than a systemic issue. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Court hearing moved to tomorrow morning. Emergency custody review." "I'm sorry. Tomorrow morning." They weren't even giving her the 24 hours Ethan had mentioned. Walking faster now, Imani headed toward the one place that still felt safe, Mrs. Chester's apartment. But as she approached the complex, she saw cars with official plates in the parking lot. Social services vehicles. Police cars. A small crowd of neighbors standing outside, watching with the morbid fascination reserved for other people's tragedies. Inside Mrs. Chester's apartment, she found Trayvon sitting at the kitchen table with a woman in a tailored suit who was asking him questions about his living situation, his relationship with his mother, his memories of his father. "Mama!" Trayvon jumped up when he saw her, running into her arms with the unself-conscious relief of a child who still believed his mother could fix anything. "Mrs. Washington, I'm Dr. Sarah Kim from Child Protective Services," the woman said, standing with professional courtesy. "I'm conducting a routine welfare assessment as part of the emergency custody review." Routine. Nothing about this felt routine to Imani, but she supposed that for Dr. Kim, destroying families was just another day at the office. "How is my son?" Imani asked, holding Trayvon tighter than she should have. "Trayvon appears healthy and well-adjusted," Dr. Kim said carefully. "However, there are concerns about the stability of his current environment. The media attention, the temporary housing situation, the ongoing investigation. These factors create an atmosphere that may not be in the child's best interests." Best interests. The phrase every social worker used to justify separating families, as if poverty and public attention were forms of child abuse. "Where's Mrs. Chester?" Imani asked, noticing the unusual quiet in the apartment. "She's been asked to provide a statement about your living arrangements," Dr. Kim replied. "She should return shortly." But Imani could see through the kitchen window that Mrs. Chester was sitting in one of the official cars, speaking with someone who was taking notes. The woman who'd shown them unconditional kindness was now being questioned about her decision to help them, probably being made to feel like an accessory to whatever crime Imani was supposedly committing. "Mama, why are all these people asking about Daddy David?" Trayvon whispered against her shoulder. "The lady wanted to know if he was my real daddy." The question shattered something inside Imani's chest. At 8 years old, Trayvon was learning that the man who'd raised him, loved him, adopted him, and died protecting their family's future might not count as his real father to strangers who'd never known the reality of their lives. "David was your real daddy in every way that mattered," she whispered back. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Dr. Kim cleared her throat. "Mrs. Washington, I need to inform you that based on preliminary findings, the court has issued a temporary custody order. Trayvon will be placed in emergency foster care pending Monday's hearing." The words hit like a physical blow. "You're taking him tonight." The placement is temporary, designed to remove the child from the current unstable environment while the investigation continues. You'll have supervised visitation rights, and if Monday's hearing goes favorably, custody could be restored. Could be restored. As if Trayvon were property that might or might not be returned to her based on her performance in legal proceedings. "I won't let you take him," Imani said, backing toward the door with Trayvon still in her arms. "Mrs. Washington, please don't make this more difficult than necessary. Fighting the order will only be used as evidence against you in court." Evidence against her. Everything was evidence against her. Her poverty, her desperation, her love, her efforts to survive. Even protecting her son from strangers who wanted to separate them would be twisted into proof that she was unfit. "Mama, what's happening?" Trayvon asked, his voice small and frightened. Imani looked down at her son's face, David's eyes, Raymond's nose, her own stubborn chin, and made the most devastating choice of her life. "These people think you might be safer somewhere else for a few days," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Just until Mama can prove that we belong together. I don't want to go, Trayvon said, tears starting to fall. I want to stay with you and Mrs. Chester. I know, baby. I know. Imani held him one last time, memorizing the weight of his body against hers, the smell of his hair, the way he fit perfectly in her arms. But sometimes we have to be brave for a little while so we can be together forever. The foster placement specialist arrived within the hour, a kind-faced black woman named Angela who clearly hated this part of her job but executed it with professional efficiency. She helped Trayvon pack his few belongings while Imani signed papers that temporarily surrendered her rights to make decisions about her own child's daily life. He'll be with the Harrington family, Angela explained quietly. They are experienced with emergency placements, and they understand this is temporary. He can call you every evening. Temporary. The word felt like a lie designed to make the unbearable seem manageable. As they walked Trayvon to the waiting car, Mrs. Chester finally returned from her interview, her eyes red with tears and righteous anger. This is wrong, she said fiercely, pulling Imani into a hug. That boy belongs with his mother. These people, they don't understand what love looks like. But as Imani watched the car disappear with her son's face pressed against the rear window, she wondered if Mrs. Chester was wrong. Maybe the people making these decisions understood love perfectly well. They just believed that some mothers didn't deserve it. The revolution that had begun with her sacrifice was now demanding the ultimate price, everything she'd been fighting to protect. And the cruelest irony was that losing Trayvon might be the only way to save him from a world that had decided her love was a liability rather than a gift. Standing in the empty parking lot with Mrs. Chester's arms around her, Imani felt the last of her hope drain away. Tomorrow's hearing would determine whether she ever got her son back, but tonight, for the first time in 9 years, she would go to sleep without knowing where Trayvon was, whether he was afraid, whether he understood that none of this was his fault. The price of survival had finally exceeded what she was capable of paying, but surrender was no longer an option. If they wanted to destroy her family, they'd have to do it in public, in court, with the whole world watching. At least then, when it was over, Trayvon would know that his mother had fought for him until the very end. Imani spent the night on Mrs. Chester's couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the absence of Trayvon's breathing from the next room. Every hour, she checked her phone for updates from Angela, but foster care protocol meant no communication until morning. Her son was sleeping in a stranger's house, probably afraid and confused, while she lay powerless to comfort him. At 5 a.m., her phone buzzed with a call from Ethan Sterling. Imani, we have a problem. Raymond's legal team contacted Channel 7 with what they are calling additional evidence about your fitness as a mother. They are planning to air it during this morning's broadcast, 2 hours before your custody hearing. What kind of evidence? Security footage from your apartment building. Apparently, there were nights when you left Trayvon alone while you worked cleaning jobs. The timestamps show you leaving at 11 p.m. and returning at 7 a.m. Imani's blood turned to ice. Those had been the worst nights, when she couldn't afford a babysitter and Trayvon was sleeping safely in their locked apartment while she cleaned office buildings 12 blocks away. She'd checked on him every few hours, calling him to make sure he was okay, rushing back if he seemed upset. It wasn't ideal, but it was survival. He was never in danger, she said weakly, knowing how that would sound to people who'd never faced the choice between leaving a child alone for a few hours or letting him go hungry for days. The optics are devastating, Ethan replied. A mother leaving an 8-year-old alone at night to work cleaning jobs she could have reported on tax forms but apparently didn't. Tax forms. Another landmine she'd forgotten about. When you're paid cash under the table because you can't afford to wait for official paychecks, tax compliance becomes a luxury you can't afford. There's more, Ethan continued. Raymond's team has phone records showing that you contacted him 3 times in the past year. They are claiming this proves you maintained a relationship while presenting yourself as a widow struggling alone. The phone calls. Imani remembered each one, desperate attempts to ask Raymond for help with Trayvon's school expenses, medical bills, anything. He'd hung up on her twice and told her never to call again during the 3rd conversation. But in court, those calls would look like evidence of deception. We need to settle, Ethan said firmly. Take the deal Rebecca outlined yesterday. Public apology, most of the money donated to charity, and Raymond withdraws his custody claim. And if I refuse? You'll lose everything. Trayvon, the money, your reputation. Raymond's team has built a case that you're an unfit mother who manipulated public sympathy for financial gain. They have evidence, witnesses, and a biological father claiming he can provide a stable home. A stable home. Raymond had disappeared when she was pregnant and penniless, but now that there was money and media attention, he'd suddenly developed paternal instincts. After hanging up, Imani sat in the pre-dawn darkness, feeling the weight of impossible choices. Accept the deal and admit to lies she'd never told, or fight and risk losing Trayvon forever. Either way, Raymond won. Either he got his son and a share of the money, or he destroyed her completely while positioning himself as the wronged father trying to protect his child. Mrs. Chester emerged from her bedroom, moving quietly in deference to the early hour and the gravity of the situation. "You not sleeping," she observed, settling beside Imani on the couch. "I can't stop thinking about what Trayvon must be feeling right now. Whether he thinks I abandoned him. That boy knows you love him. Love doesn't disappear because of courtrooms and lawyers." Mrs. Chester's simple wisdom cut through the legal complexity that threatened to drown Imani. Whatever happened in court today, whatever deals she made or fights she chose, Trayvon would carry the memory of their life together. The bedtime stories, the homework help, the way she'd held him when he cried for David, the 1,000 small acts of love that had nothing to do with blood relation or legal documents. At 7 a.m., Imani's phone rang with a call that changed everything. "Mrs. Washington, this is Harold from the pawn shop. I know you got a lot going on, but I thought you should know. Someone came in yesterday asking about your husband's ring. Offered me $5,000 for it." $5,000. For a ring Harold had valued at 4 to 5. "Who?" "Wouldn't give his name, but he knew all about your situation. Said the ring would be worth a lot more to collectors now that your story was famous. I told him the ring wasn't for sale. It's still in your redemption period if you can come up with the money." Imani's mind raced. Someone was trying to profit from David's ring, to turn even that sacred symbol into merchandise for her unwanted fame. "Harold," she said slowly, "I need to ask you something. The security footage you posted, did someone ask you to film our transaction?" Silence stretched across the line before Harold answered. "Look, Mrs. Washington, I feel bad about what happened. Your story got bigger than I ever expected. But yeah, someone had been asking me to keep an eye out for interesting situations. Said there might be money in it if I captured the right kind of human interest story." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Harold hadn't posted her footage out of guilt or social consciousness. He'd been paid to watch for exactly the kind of desperate transaction she'd made. "Who?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Some legal firm. Sterling and Associates. Said they were documenting how the pawnshop industry exploits vulnerable people." Ethan Sterling. Her own lawyer had orchestrated the viral video that destroyed her privacy and put Trayvon in danger. He'd been planning to sue someone, the pawnshop, the city, whoever looked most liable, and needed documentation of systematic failures. Her desperation had been the evidence he was waiting for. "Mrs. Washington? You still there?" "I'm here," she managed to say. "Harold, I'll be in this morning to get David's ring back." After hanging up, Imani felt something crystallize inside her chest. Not hope, exactly, but clarity. For weeks, she'd been reacting to other people's manipulation of her story, letting lawyers and reporters and bureaucrats define what her choices meant. But if Ethan had orchestrated this entire situation, if her viral fame had been manufactured to serve his legal strategy, then maybe the rules were different than she'd been told. She called Rebecca Chester first. "Rebecca, this is Imani Washington. I need to know something, and I need you to be honest with me. How long has Ethan been planning to sue the city over inadequate social services?" Rebecca's pause told her everything. "Imani, I think you should discuss this with Ethan directly." "How long?" "The preliminary research began 6 months ago. After your husband's death was reported in the obituaries, Ethan's firm identified you as a potential plaintiff in a systemic failure lawsuit. But Imani, that doesn't change the fact that what happened to you was wrong, or that legal action could create real change." Imani hung up. 6 months. Ethan had been watching her struggle, waiting for her to reach the breaking point that would provide dramatic evidence for his lawsuit. Harold's pawnshop footage wasn't a spontaneous act of conscience. It was the culmination of a legal strategy that treated her desperation as a business opportunity. Every piece of advice Ethan had given her, every strategy session, every warning about the consequences of fighting, all of it designed to control her response and maximize the lawsuit's potential value. He didn't want her to settle because it was best for her and Trayvon. He wanted her to settle because it would preserve his case against the city while keeping her grateful enough not to question his methods. But understanding the manipulation also revealed her power. If Ethan needed her cooperation to succeed, if Raymond's custody claim was based on manufactured evidence, if the entire narrative had been constructed rather than discovered, then she could deconstruct it just as deliberately. Imani looked at Mrs. Chester, who was watching her with the patient attention of someone who'd survived her own share of impossible choices. "I'm not taking the deal," Imani said. "What you going to do instead?" "I'm going to tell the truth. All of it. Even the parts that make me look bad. Even the parts that don't fit anyone's narrative. I'm going to walk into that courtroom and fight for my son, not because I'm perfect, but because love doesn't require perfection." The impossible choice wasn't between accepting the deal or fighting the case. It was between letting others define her story or finding the courage to speak for herself, knowing that the truth was messier than anyone's legal strategy but more powerful than anyone's lies. For the first time in weeks, Imani felt like herself again. Not a victim, not a symbol, not a case study, but a mother who'd made hard choices with love and determination. Win or lose, Trayvon would know that she'd fought for him with everything she had. The revolution was finally hers to lead. The courthouse steps felt like a battlefield as Imani walked toward the entrance, flanked by Mrs. Chester and followed by a growing crowd of reporters. But something had changed in her posture overnight. Gone was the hunched defensiveness of a woman trying to disappear, replaced by the straight-backed determination of someone who'd finally remembered her own strength. Ethan Sterling waited inside the courthouse lobby, his expensive suit and practiced confidence suddenly looking hollow to Imani's newly clear vision. "Imani, thank God," he said, rushing toward her. "I was worried you might do something rash. The settlement offer is still on the table, but we need to move quickly." "No," Imani said simply, her voice carrying a calm authority that stopped Ethan mid-sentence. "I'm not settling. I'm not apologizing. And I'm not letting you speak for me anymore." Ethan's face shifted through confusion, concern, and finally calculation. "Imani, I understand you're emotional, but this isn't the time for dramatic gestures. Raymond's legal team has prepared a devastating case. Without the settlement, you don't get your $20 million lawsuit against the city," Imani interrupted. "That's what this has always been about, hasn't it? You needed the perfect victim, so you manufactured one." The color drained from Ethan's face. Around them, reporters were straining to hear the conversation, sensing that the morning's biggest story was unfolding in real time. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," Ethan said carefully, "but you're making a serious mistake. Without legal representation." "I'll represent myself," Imani announced, her voice carrying to the reporters now openly recording. "I think it's time everyone heard the real story, not the version that's been edited to serve everyone else's agenda." Before Ethan could respond, the courtroom doors opened, and they were called inside. The custody hearing that was supposed to be a routine proceeding had transformed into something unprecedented, a mother refusing all professional help to speak her truth in her own words. Judge Patricia Coleman was a black woman in her 50s who'd built her reputation on cutting through legal theater to focus on children's welfare. She looked skeptically at Imani as she approached the petitioner's table alone. "Mrs. Washington, I strongly advise you to accept counsel. Family court procedures are complex, and the stakes are." "Your Honor," Imani interrupted respectfully. "I've been told what the stakes are by everyone except my son. With your permission, I'd like to speak for myself and for him." On the other side of the courtroom, Raymond sat with two lawyers who'd clearly expected this to be a formality. He looked older than Imani remembered, softer around the middle, wearing a wedding ring that suggested he'd built the stable life he'd denied her when she needed it most. "Very well," Judge Coleman said. "But I won't allow this proceeding to become a media circus. We're here to determine what's in the best interests of Trayvon Washington, not to relitigate your personal history." "That's exactly what I want to talk about, Your Honor. Trayvon Washington. That's his name, not Fletcher, not whatever my biological contribution should matter, but Washington, because that's the man who raised him, loved him, and died protecting our family's future." Imani moved to the center of the courtroom, addressing Judge Coleman but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. 3 weeks ago, I pawned my wedding ring to buy groceries for my son. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I thought it was private. I thought it was just another sacrifice in a long line of sacrifices that mothers make every day. I had no idea that someone was waiting, watching, hoping I'd reach exactly that breaking point. She turned toward Ethan, who was trying to signal her to stop talking. "Mr. Sterling's firm has been tracking me since my husband died, waiting for me to become desperate enough to serve as evidence in a lawsuit they were planning against the city. The pawnshop footage wasn't posted by a guilty conscience. It was commissioned by lawyers who needed dramatic proof of systemic failure. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Coleman banged her gavel for order. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Washington. Do you have evidence to support it? I have Harold Brennan's sworn statement that Sterling and Associates paid him to document interesting human interest stories involving desperate customers. I have phone records showing contact between Mr. Sterling's firm and the pawnshop before my transaction. And I have Rebecca Chester's admission that they'd been researching my situation for 6 months. Imani pulled out a folder containing documents she'd gathered during her sleepless night, proof that her viral moment had been orchestrated by people who profited from her pain. But here's what they didn't plan on, she continued, her voice growing stronger. They thought I'd be so grateful for their help that I wouldn't question their methods. They thought poverty had made me helpless, that single motherhood had made me vulnerable to anyone offering assistance. She faced Raymond directly for the first time in 9 years. And you, she said, her voice carrying both pain and power. You disappeared when I was pregnant and afraid. You denied paternity, refused support, told me I was trying to trap you with a baby you claimed probably wasn't yours. For 9 years, you've been absent while David changed diapers, attended school conferences, taught Trayvon to ride a bike, and loved him unconditionally. Raymond's lawyers whispered urgently in his ear, but Imani continued. Now, because strangers have donated money to help us survive, you suddenly want custody. Not because you love Trayvon, you don't even know him. Not because you can provide a better home, you've never provided anything. You want custody because you think you can profit from our story just like everyone else who's treated our lives like a business opportunity. Judge Coleman leaned forward. Mrs. Washington, what exactly are you asking this court to do? I'm asking you to see past the spectacle and focus on what actually matters. Trayvon has lived in my care for 9 years. He's healthy, loved, and thriving despite the circumstances that brought us here. The media attention is temporary. The investigation is based on manufactured controversy. But my love for my son, and his need for the stability I've provided since birth, that's permanent. Imani opened her phone and showed Judge Coleman a video she'd recorded that morning. This is a statement from Angela Harrington, the foster care specialist who placed Trayvon yesterday. She confirms that he's been asking for me constantly, that he doesn't understand why he was removed from a loving home, and that forcing this separation is causing genuine trauma to a child who's already lost his adoptive father. The video played in the silent courtroom, Angela's professional voice confirming that Trayvon was safe but confused, that he'd asked repeatedly why people were trying to take him away from his mama, that the emergency placement was causing more harm than the situation it was meant to protect him from. Your Honor, Imani said as the video ended, I'm not a perfect mother. I've made hard choices, sometimes desperate choices, but every choice was made with love and Trayvon's welfare as my priority. I can't promise I'll never struggle again, but I can promise that my son will always be my first priority. She turned to face the packed courtroom, speaking directly to the cameras and reporters who'd turned her private pain into public entertainment. To everyone who donated money because my story moved you, thank you. That generosity has shown Trayvon that the world contains more kindness than cruelty. But to everyone who's used our situation to advance their own agenda, who's tried to profit from our pain or turn our love into a legal strategy, you've shown him something else entirely. Imani's voice carried the weight of every mother who'd ever been judged for surviving, every woman who'd been told her love wasn't enough, every family that had been destroyed by systems claiming to protect them. I'm not asking for anyone's charity anymore. I'm demanding justice. Justice for families who struggle without viral videos to make their pain visible. Justice for mothers who make impossible choices without lawyers to explain why those choices were necessary. Justice for children who deserve to stay with the people who love them, even when those people aren't perfect. The courtroom erupted in applause that Judge Coleman made no effort to stop. In the gallery, Imani could see Mrs. Chester crying, reporters typing frantically, and strangers who'd come to witness what they thought would be a routine custody transfer but had instead seen something unprecedented. Raymond's lead attorney stood to respond, but before he could speak, Raymond himself was rising, his face pale and his hands shaking. Your Honor, Raymond said quietly, I need to withdraw my petition. The courtroom fell silent. His lawyers stared at him in shock. I need to withdraw my petition for custody, Raymond repeated, looking directly at Imani for the first time. She's right. I don't know Trayvon. I've never been his father in any way that matters. I came here because. He paused, struggling with words. Because I thought I deserved something. But she's the one who deserves everything. Judge Coleman studied Raymond carefully. Mr. Fletcher, you understand that withdrawing your petition means giving up any future claim to custody or the financial support that's been donated. I understand, Raymond said. I also understand that some mistakes can't be fixed, but they don't have to be repeated. He looked at Imani one more time. I'm sorry, he said simply. For everything. Trayvon is lucky to have you as his mother. Judge Coleman banged her gavel to restore order as the courtroom exploded with reaction. Based on the withdrawal of Mr. Fletcher's petition and the evidence presented regarding the child's welfare, I'm ordering the immediate return of Trayvon Washington to his mother's custody. Furthermore, I'm directing the state to close its investigation and restore all frozen assets to Mrs. Washington's control. She looked sternly at Ethan Sterling, who'd been trying to leave quietly during the chaos. Mr. Sterling, I'm also recommending that the State Bar investigate your firm's methods in this case. Using vulnerable families as unwitting plaintiffs in manufactured controversies may not be illegal, but it's certainly unethical. As the gavel fell and the courtroom erupted in celebration, Imani felt something she hadn't experienced in months: complete, overwhelming relief. Not just because she'd won, but because she'd found her voice again. She'd remembered that survival didn't require silence, that love didn't require perfection, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act was simply refusing to be anyone other than yourself. Angela appeared at her side with official paperwork authorizing Trayvon's immediate release from foster care. Through the courthouse windows, Imani could see news vans preparing to broadcast the story of a mother who'd fought the entire system and won, not through lawyers or manipulation, but through the simple power of speaking her truth. The revolution was finally complete, but it had been won by love, not litigation. And for the first time since David's death, Imani felt ready to build a future worthy of everything they'd sacrificed to reach this moment. But first, she had a son to collect and a promise to keep. That love, when it's real and fierce and uncompromising, could overcome anything the world tried to use against it. 6 months later, Imani stood in the pawn shop where everything had begun, holding $247 in her hand, more than 5 times what Harold had originally offered for David's ring. The money came from her first paycheck as a student nurse at City General Hospital, where she'd been accepted into an accelerated program funded by a scholarship foundation that had emerged from the national conversation her story had sparked. You sure about this? Harold asked, carefully removing David's ring from the display case where it had sat untouched despite dozens of offers from collectors and curiosity seekers. That ring's probably worth 10 times this amount now, with all the attention. It was never about the money, Imani replied, slipping the simple gold band onto her right hand. For the first time in 6 months, she felt complete again, not because she needed the ring to remember David, but because reclaiming it symbolized her transformation from a desperate woman selling her most precious possession to someone strong enough to buy back what was hers. Through the pawnshop window, she could see Trayvon waiting in Mrs. Chester's car, working on homework while the 2 women who'd become her chosen family chatted in the front seat. Mrs. Chester had insisted on driving them today, declaring that some moments were too important to navigate alone. Mrs. Washington, Harold said quietly, I need to apologize again for what my part in all this cost you and your boy. Imani studied Harold's face, older now, marked by what she'd come to recognize as the peculiar burden of people who'd discovered their small choices could have enormous consequences. He'd testified against Ethan Sterling's firm during the ethics investigation, revealing how lawyers had paid him to document opportunities involving desperate customers. The scandal had destroyed Sterling's practice and led to new regulations protecting vulnerable people from predatory legal recruitment. You were being used too, Imani said finally. The difference is, when you realized what was happening, you tried to make it right. Harold had indeed tried to make amends. He'd voluntarily testified in the class action lawsuit that emerged against Sterling's firm. Not the lawsuit Ethan had originally planned, but one filed by the families he'd manipulated. He'd also changed his business practices, partnering with local social services to connect struggling customers with legitimate assistance programs instead of just offering cash for their belongings. Outside, Imani found Trayvon exactly where she'd left him, bent over his math homework with the focused concentration that reminded her constantly of David. At 9 years old, he'd grown taller and more serious, marked by experiences no child should have but strengthened rather than broken by them. Did you get it back, Mamau? He asked, looking up with eyes that held both David's warmth and a new understanding of how precious and fragile security could be. I got it back, Imani confirmed, showing him the ring now on her finger. Daddy David's ring is home where it belongs. Trayvon smiled, the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him since the custody hearing. The past 6 months had been healing time for both of them, a period of rebuilding trust not just with the world but with each other. Therapy had helped Trayvon process the confusion and fear of those weeks when strangers had made decisions about his life. It had helped Imani understand that protecting him didn't mean shielding him from every difficulty, but rather teaching him that love could survive even the worst challenges. "Mrs. Chester says we're celebrating tonight," Trayvon said, carefully packing his homework. She made dumplings. Mrs. Chester had indeed made dumplings, along with an entire feast that awaited them back at their new apartment. Not the subsidized housing where they'd struggled before, but a modest 2-bedroom place near the hospital where Imani worked and Trayvon attended a school that had embraced them both with genuine warmth. The apartment was filled with more than food when they arrived. Angela Harrington, the foster care worker who'd become an unexpected ally, was there with her own family. Dr. Kim from Child Protective Services had stopped by with documents officially closing their case. Even James was there, having slowly rebuilt a friendship with Imani based on honesty rather than hidden agendas. "Speech," Mrs. Chester announced as they gathered around the dining table she'd insisted on buying for Imani's new place. Imani must give speech. Imani looked around the table at the faces that had become her chosen family, not the nuclear unit she'd originally planned with David, but something deeper and more complex. A community built not on obligation or circumstance, but on the recognition that love came in many forms and that survival was easier when people chose to care for each other. 6 months ago, Imani began, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. I was wrong. I hadn't lost everything. I'd just forgotten who I was underneath all the fear and desperation. She looked at Trayvon, who was listening with the serious attention he gave to important things. Your daddy David used to tell me that the strongest people weren't the ones who never fell down, but the ones who got back up and helped others do the same. I think I finally understand what he meant. The celebration continued late into the evening, filled with laughter and stories and the comfortable chaos of people who'd chosen to become family. When everyone finally left and Trayvon was asleep in his own room, decorated with posters he'd chosen himself and books he was actually excited to read, Imani sat alone in her small living room, processing the long journey from that desperate morning in the pawn shop to this moment of genuine peace. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the kind of message that 6 months ago would have triggered panic. Now she opened it with curiosity rather than fear. Saw your story on the anniversary special. My name is Jennifer, and I'm a single mom in Ohio facing eviction. I don't want charity, but I was wondering if you have any advice for someone who feels like she's drowning. The message was one of dozens Imani received weekly. Women facing their own impossible choices, men struggling to provide for their families, young people aging out of foster care who'd seen her story and found hope in her transformation. She'd started answering them personally, offering not financial assistance but something more valuable. The reminder that survival was possible and that asking for help was a sign of strength, not weakness. Imani typed back, the most important thing I learned is that you're stronger than your circumstances, even when it doesn't feel that way. What specific challenge are you facing right now? As she waited for Jennifer's response, Imani looked around her small apartment, modest but comfortable, earned rather than given, filled with the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt on her own terms. The nursing school acceptance letter hung framed on the wall, next to Trayvon's latest report card and a photo of David that no longer triggered overwhelming grief but rather gentle gratitude for the love they'd shared. The GoFundMe money, after legal fees and her voluntary donations to established family assistance programs, had provided a foundation of security she'd never experienced before. Not wealth, but stability. The knowledge that Trayvon would have what he needed, that she could pursue her education without sacrificing his welfare, that unexpected expenses wouldn't destroy everything they'd built. More importantly, the ordeal had taught her something about her own power. The woman who'd walked into that pawn shop 6 months ago had believed she was powerless, dependent on others' charity and mercy. The woman sitting in this apartment now understood that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was the foundation of genuine strength, because only people brave enough to acknowledge their struggles could find the courage to overcome them. Her phone buzzed with Jennifer's response, then another message from a different stranger. Then a call from a local news station asking if she'd comment on new legislation inspired by her case, laws designed to protect families from predatory legal practices and ensure that emergency assistance was truly available to those who needed it. Imani smiled, recognizing that her revolution was still expanding, still touching lives and changing systems in ways she'd never imagined possible. The desperate mother who'd sold her wedding ring had accidentally become an advocate, a voice for families who struggled in silence, a reminder that American dream rhetoric meant nothing if basic survival remained out of reach for people willing to work for it. Tomorrow, she'd return to her nursing classes, continuing the education David had always encouraged her to pursue. Next week, she'd speak at a conference about family services reform, sharing her story not as a victim but as someone who'd survived and thrived. Next month, she'd walk across a graduation stage, receiving her nursing degree in front of Trayvon, Mrs. Chester, and everyone else who'd believed in her potential even when she'd forgotten it herself. But tonight, she was simply a mother who'd fought for her son and won, a woman who'd found her voice and used it to change the world in small but meaningful ways, a survivor who'd learned that the most powerful revolutions began not with grand gestures but with ordinary people refusing to accept that their love wasn't strong enough to overcome any obstacle. David's ring caught the lamplight as she reached for her phone to answer another call from another stranger who'd seen her story and found hope in it. The ring was home where it belonged, on the hand of a woman who'd finally learned that she belonged wherever she decided to plant her roots and grow. The revolution continued, one conversation at a time, one family at a time, one mother at a time, discovering that love, when it was fierce and real and uncompromising, could indeed change everything. What did this story teach you about the power of refusing to let others define your worth? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world.